And welcome to the School of Government. Delighted to see a good crowd here. My name is Chris Deerin. I work in the external relations team here, and I'm also Scotland editor of the New Statesman. And we've got a great panel for you this evening. I'll start with Danny Dorling, Professor Danny Dorling, who is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography here at Oxford. Danny's well known as a sort of analyst and critic of income inequality in the UK, and I think it's fair to say has been allied a bit with the current Labour leadership and the Lib Dems and Greens you were saying as well. So if it's left, you grab it and run with it. Actually, Danny was the subject of a Guardian leader, which not many of us can say, where they quoted him saying, "I'm hardly saying we want a revolution, we want a utopia. I'm just saying, can we be slightly less stupid?" Which I think is a saying for our times. And next to Danny, we have Kate Forbes. So Kate is the member of the Scottish Parliament for Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch, and Kate's actually travelled down from Dingwall in the Highlands today to come to our debate, so we're very grateful. Kate's a Cambridge graduate, which we won't hold against her. That's, and she was elected to the Scottish Parliament in 2016 with a majority of 9,000 as part of that enormous surge that we've seen from the SNP in Scotland over the last 2 or 3 years since the independence referendum. She's currently a member of the SNP's Growth Commission, which for those of us who are Scottish is kind of one of the more important things going on, because that's the committee that's going to work up a kind of economic roadmap to independence so that we aren't quite as scared as maybe some of us were in 2014 at the idea of being broke. You're going to come up with great plans, Kate.
Indeed.
That'll be good. Next to me I have Lord Willetts, David Willetts, who I'm sure will be familiar to most of you, former Conservative MP and a very highly regarded universities minister for a period. I think it's safe to say that, David, you were one of the sort of centrist thought leaders in the Conservative Party during that era when you were getting thumped repeatedly by Tony Blair, so you helped navigate a path back to power there. And you're now Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation, which is one of probably the most impressive think tanks in London at the moment. And finally, David Aronovitch, another familiar face, journalist, broadcaster and author. His most recent book, which I can highly recommend, is called Party Animals, My Family and Other Communists. David writes once a week in the Times, sometimes twice, if you can be.
Sometimes 3 times.
Sometimes 3 times. He has a lie down after that. And I think it's safe to say you've been a stern critic of the Corbyn leadership and maybe some of the anti-Semitism and things that we've seen coming out of that. I noticed, I was just looking through your past columns, and there was one headline which seemed to sum things up, which was, "Yikes, I might have to vote for the Tories." Is that still?
No, I voted and I didn't.
Ah, couldn't bring yourself.
No. We'll come on to that.
So what I'm going to do is I'll get each of our panellists to speak for 5 or so minutes. They've each selected a topic. And then after that, I'll open it up to questions, and you can see. But I thought just to start, just out of interest, I wonder if anyone here would just like to let us know the kind of issues that have grabbed you. Just quickly, just in a sentence, what in this general election has leapt out at you just before we start, because I think it would be useful for the speakers to get a sense of your priorities. So does anyone want to put their hand up and tell us what's grabbed them in the last month or so? Yeah, just it. We'll just wait for the microphone, sorry. I should also tell you this is being live streamed on YouTube. So.
Well, responses to terror attacks and security.
Yep.
Well, for a general election that was going to be about Brexit, there's been quite a lot on public services, and I've been quite interested in the debates around funding thereof, where there's been lots of back and forth between the parties. But what's interested me most is that the link between the two things has not really been made. So depending on one's assumptions about how Brexit looks has a massive impact on the public finances over the next 5 years. And we seem to be talking about figures that are predicated upon business as usual. And the one thing we know is we're not going to have business as usual. So that's been an interesting absence for me in the election campaign so far.
Yeah. Down here.
I would like some clarification on the Labour Party's stand on Brexit.
Wouldn't we all? And then one more there.
the coalescing of support with the two largest parties, both running ahead of the government in 2015.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, we'll leave it there just now. Obviously, this is an important election. It's not going perhaps the way that the experts, to quote Michael Gove, predicted, so we thought it would possibly be a landslide for Theresa May. It's not looking like that anymore. The reasons for that, we can discuss, but the developing view seems to be that Jeremy Corbyn's had a good campaign and Theresa May hasn't. But the result is going to matter hugely for us all, both in terms of public spending, the shape of the Brexit that we're about to have. It's going to matter for the future of the Union, depending on what Scotland does. And obviously the future of the Labour Party is at stake. That's not going away. And the dog that hasn't barked is the Lib Dems. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there, if anything. So I'll just now hand over to the panellists. So we'll just start on right or left, depending on which way you're facing.
Great. 5 general minutes. I said I'll talk about education as we're in Oxford, so I'll do that. But before I begin, just to get an idea of who you are, who's in Oxford East constituency as a voter? Okay, and you've decided to sit on that side of the room. That's interesting. Oxford West and Abingdon? Okay, on that side of the room. Can't be chance, can it? Rest of Oxfordshire, any other seat in Oxfordshire? Okay, and people who will be voting not in this county, and people who don't have a vote. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Yep. Okay. Oxford West and Abingdon, please vote Lib Dem. You'll probably know why, but that is one of the close seats in the country. It's one of the ones that can make a difference. Oxford East, please vote Labour. Probably going to win anyway, but please vote Labour. Elsewhere in the county, you can probably vote Green if you want to. It'll make little difference. Apart from Witney, you never know what might happen in Witney because the candidate's been so truly awful there, the one who took it over from David Cameron. This is going to be a very polarised election. You've got two parties offering very, very different things. The Conservative Party have actually stepped to the left. I've read through the Conservative Party manifesto. It includes some quite stunning statements, a lot about meritocracy, but also statements such as the legalised compulsory purchase of land at, I think, at agricultural prices, if needed for house building, which you wouldn't normally see in a Conservative manifesto. So we're seeing a step to the left. Labour has moved to what a normal left-wing European party looks like. There's nothing that exciting about it. It's offering to raise about £48 billion, which is about half the extra money that the Sunday Times Rich List got in the last year. So it's not actually very much. But to raise a little bit more in terms of finances so that we can go up 1 or 2% on public spending and still be one of the worst public spenders in Europe. The countries who spend well publicly are Finland and Germany and France and so on, where what Labour are promising are nothing near that. But of course they're not promising the annihilation of the public sector, which is what the Conservatives have given you. 6 teachers in every state secondary school got to go. Hinksey Primary School here will no longer have a caretaker. Rose Hill Primary couldn't fix their boiler. It's just embarrassing. If you've got any sense of justice. And why do the Conservatives fund state education so poorly? Because they don't think it should be well funded. It's as simple as that. If you take a controversial policy, and one that David Willetts has been associated with, university tuition fees. We never debate these properly. Of course, as you know, across most of Europe, fees are tiny or, in fact, non-existent. 8% of students nationally also don't pay fees. And this isn't known, and this really should be debated. 8% of students at universities in Britain have no student loan. They won't have to pay back £50,000 or £100,000. Those 8%, in Oxford it's probably nearer 20, those 8% are the students whose mum or dad or grandparents just pay the tuition fees at the start for them. We have an incredibly unfair system in this country where the richer you are, the less you pay for your education at university. So the abolition of tuition fees, becoming normally European again, is about justice so that the very richest families don't get away scot-free, paying very low taxes and their children having no student debt. And I just wish we could get some understanding of that's the way the policy is. We have a National Health Service which is in appalling crisis. We spend half as much per head as they spend in Switzerland. We spend much less than Germany, much less than France. You have to fund it. It can be very efficient, but you have to fund it. We are the only country in Europe which has had no increase in life expectancy since 2011. Right, that is stunning. It isn't just the NHS. Social care is more important than the NHS. And the fact that pensioner poverty has flatlined since 2011, no improvement in pensioner poverty since 2011, is another reason why we've had no increase in life expectancy over 5 years. Whereas at the same time, in Norway and Finland, their life expectancy has gone up by a whole year. That's the kind of thing you get if you have a more pro-social government that doesn't simply try to tax the state away by reducing corporation tax to an absolute minimum. We've become a very weird country. Since the early 1980s, our politics has moved to the right, to the right, to the right, to the right. I don't think Corbyn's Labour Party is very different from Angela Merkel's party in Germany in terms of its policies. And it's not that they've become more left-wing in Germany or more left-wing in France. We've become strange. We're now beginning to move backwards. Brexit, there are different options. There are options to Brexit in the same, or to be similar to Switzerland or Norway, and there are options to be like Turkey. And hard Brexit means being like Turkey with slightly less rights than Turkish people currently have. So if the person who asks what's going to happen economically, compare Turkey to Norway or Switzerland and think about our choices. Of course, Norway and Switzerland have free movement of labour. You can't have your cake and eat it, particularly if you've had a financial sector which has done as badly as our financial sector. We do not have strong arguments on the table. We currently have JP Morgan buying a building in Dublin for 136 million. This is already happening. Here in this city, we have the highest earning from the European Research Council of anywhere in the whole continent. So we're not going to do particularly well, but it's not just about the posh parts of the city. We also have a BMW car plant where all the workers received a letter from BMW before the referendum, basically giving them an indication of what was likely to happen. So this city is in bad trouble when it comes to what's going to happen with Brexit. And last thing I'll say on polls, I looked at the last 2,000 polls a couple of weeks ago. It's roughly a poll held on average every day, 2,000 polls since 2010. And the polls are generally off. But for the last two general elections, 2010 and 2015, the polls were absolutely spot on 4 weeks after the election. Now, this is probably partly chance and partly randomness, but I suspect if we were to ask you all how would you vote in an election tomorrow, and me, the answer that I would give and the answer you would give has more to do with how you would have voted at an election a couple of weeks ago. Because you know how you feel, you don't know how you're going to feel as you're walking through the door of the polling booth. So the polls have tended to lag. The interesting thing there is that the polls may not be as ridiculous as you think. If the country is moving away from somebody who repeats strong and stable all the time, and towards a party where somebody you're told was completely incompetent just looks like a fairly steady old man who doesn't contradict himself and keeps on saying the same thing in a kind of strong and steady way, if that's what the country is beginning to realise, and if the choices are beginning to become clear between no costed manifesto and obviously more cuts and the rich doing better, or the beginning of a move towards decent public services, I think First Aid could be very interesting. The one thing I know nothing about is how well they have targeted voters in the 60 marginal constituencies. And I'm really hoping that old people in those constituencies don't use Facebook. And if old people don't use Facebook or Twitter very much, and if young people have become savvy to target marketing, then the millions of pounds that's been spent by the Conservatives to try to buy votes may not be as effective as they think. But we'll know by Friday morning. Thank you.
Danny, I've just got one follow-up on that. So as a Scot, the tuition fees issue is something that we talk about a lot. So in Scotland, tuition is free if you are a Scot or a European, but if you're English, you have to pay, which is just out of spite, I think. But nevertheless, you know, statistics came out recently that show that the number of kids from underprivileged backgrounds going to uni is climbing in England, and it's falling in Scotland, despite the fact that it is free. So, you know, one of those things that if it works, then, you know, why ideologically?
Oh, okay. There's two things. One is it doesn't work. So those statistics don't take account of the actual way in which higher education in Scotland works and the choices that are on offer. And so there is higher education that isn't officially called higher education that people go to. So there's a problem with statistics there. Secondly, in England, where it's now over £9,000 a year, we do all we can in terms of universities to try to get every last body in. And the schools tell their children all to go to university because the schools are graded by how many of their children go to university. The universities are desperate to take everybody in, so of course you get an increase. And then you get an increased number of people dropping out after the first or second year with this awful debt they've got. If you turn something into a market, which is what we've done in higher education, and it's bigger than the entire electricity and gas market of the UK now, higher education, you will try to convince people to go. But it is not necessarily in their interest. You want a sensible, normal higher education system where you're not going because people working in marketing have targeted you. There are universities in the private sector in America that spend more money on their marketing departments than on the entire teaching budget of the university. And the danger of where we've been heading in terms of the UK is towards that privatised, bogus Trump university style higher education. That's, apart from many other reasons, is why you want to stay with a normal European model, the Scottish model.
All right, next up, Kate.
Great, thank you. Well, if you remember back to Brenda from Bristol, who said not another one when the election was announced, spare a thought for the Scots who've averaged an election or a referendum every year for the last 10 years. So we're all pretty tired. But it's fascinating being here tonight and hearing about the issues that are at stake in this election. Because in Scotland, the lines are drawn in a very, very different way. So rather than being drawn on left and right, as is the case south of the border, we are still talking along constitutional lines, and probably more so than ever. And try as the SNP might to bring the debate back onto issues to do with public services, austerity, education, health, these bigger issues. The Conservatives have honed in on this independence referendum issue and have run their entire campaign quite effectively off the back of stopping another independence referendum. So coming down south from the metropolis of Dingwall this morning, you drive past big signs, vote Conservative to stop another independence referendum. And that is the caption. So, and that debate's become even more complex with Brexit being thrown into the mix. And that's why it's really become a two-horse race, because Labour and the Lib Dems have really struggled to get their message across in trying to, well, wanting to talk either about Brexit in the Lib Dems case or to talk about left-wing policies, as in Labour's case. They've been drowned out with the battle lines being drawn on constitutional issues. And that's really revitalised the Conservative and Unionist Party, with the emphasis on Unionist Party. And so just three quick reflections on the view from Scotland. One on the Conservatives, secondly on the sort of new nationalism I think that we are seeing in Scotland, and then thirdly what the results, whatever they are, will tell us on Thursday this week. We have had a very different debate in Scotland. We have had our own TV debates, for example. We've got our own party leaders. We've got the SNP who are both defending a record and trying to oppose a government. And we've got the Conservatives doing that in reverse. And that means that when issues like Theresa May's weakness and wobbliness, for example, or when Jeremy Corbyn does something, I think it is less powerful in determining how people are going to vote on the 8th of June in Scotland, because we've had our own devolved debate, as it were. So on to the Conservatives. I already said that it's really a one-issue party at the moment in Scotland, fighting on the union. And there's an interesting question there about how sustainable that is. There's talk about a Conservative comeback. But their weakest point is when they try and defend the Westminster government. So when put on the spot in defending Westminster Tory policies, that is when they are at their weakness. But on the union, they're attracting votes from all over the place. They're attracting votes from Labour voters, from Lib Dems, with this battle to save the union. And I think what we're seeing too is a confused conservatism. We're seeing a different approach to Conservative policies in Westminster. To give you a few examples, if you take the Conservative manifesto and the issue on scrapping or reducing winter fuel payments, Theresa May has said that there will be one policy for England and Wales and a different policy for Scotland. If you look at something like the so-called rape clause, which has received a lot more attention in Scotland, with this is the case with the cap on 2 children in terms of benefits, but exemptions being made for 3rd or 4th children that are born as a result of rape. It's a very uncomfortable subject, but it's received a lot of attention in Scotland, with various different charities just refusing to go along with this policy. And also on Theresa May's various different U-turns. But again, these have less of an impact in Scotland. So that's how the Conservatives have approached this election. On the other side, you have the SNP. Now, I got involved with the SNP really on the basis of 2 principles. One is aspiration and one is responsibility. And that is where my nationalism and my membership of the SNP comes from. But as you'll know, that nationalism has never been fuelled by a cultural nationalism. So if you think of the whole idea of imagined communities and being members of groups and what it is that signals that joint membership of a group, in Scotland it's never been your tartan, it's never been shortbread, it's never been bagpipes. And the question is what is it? What is this apparent civic nationalism that encourages people to vote for the SNP? And I think in previous elections, the SNP has won support from unionists as well on the basis of being competent at government. But at the moment, the question for the SNP is where do they get their support? And post-2014, what we've seen is just far more entrenched and increasingly entrenched positions across constitutional lines. And we no longer have the advantage of surprise on the independence question. We no longer have people coming at it fresh and still to make up their minds. For the most part, people have made up their minds, and that's how they will vote in this coming general election, either for the Conservatives, with a few for Labour, or for the SNP. Brexit adds an interesting dimension too, in that 62% of people resident in Scotland voted to remain in the Union, and in the days afterwards, Nicola Sturgeon talked about trying to find a compromise solution, talked about trying to keep the UK in the single market, and then on March 13th of this year said that independence, another referendum, would be back on the table. And in the weeks after that, there was a vote in Holyrood with the majority of MSPs voting to start that process for another independence referendum. But our manifesto is very, very, very clear in trying to frame the whole question around who stands up for Scotland. So we don't know what will happen on the 8th of June. We don't know which polls to believe necessarily, and we don't know what the role of the SNP will be in that. But Nicola Sturgeon is very much trying to frame it in terms of who stands up for Scotland. Will it be Conservative MPs who just rubber stamp Theresa May's hard Brexit deal, or will it be SNP MPs who have used the powers that they've or their positions over the last 2 years to try and make some differences for Scotland? But all in all, there's no new message. It is about the Conservatives fighting to save the Union and the SNP talking about being stronger for Scotland and returning SNP MPs who will stand up for Scotland. There's also an effort to try and remind voters of the toxicity of Conservatives, because I personally don't maintain that this is a sustainable Conservative comeback. I think that this apparent rise in support for the Conservatives is largely based on the unionist part of their name, not on the conservatism in their name. So lastly, what will June 8th tell us? I'm not sure it will tell us much about what's going on in Scotland. The independence debate is not going to die. It will not die for the foreseeable future. If you look at various different surveys and polls, support for independence, particularly around amongst the youngest age groups, is incredibly high. So in March, just one ScotSend poll who has been asking the same questions for the last few years, found that amongst the 16 to 24 age group, support for independence is at 72%. Support amongst the over 65s is at 26%. So demographics alone, you're seeing a shift towards supporting independence. And with that, I'll close.
Well, just one very quick question for you, Kate. With the benefit of hindsight, do you think it was a strategic miscalculation by Nicola Sturgeon to call a second, or to ask for a second referendum? Because that really has fueled the Tory resurgence in Scotland, because those people that are entrenched on both sides, but on the unionist side, are now feeling quite angry about the fact that, you know, within a few years of having said no, they're now being forced to go back to the polls again. And it feels as if perhaps that the situation is being engineered towards another independence vote rather than taking place because it's legitimate to have one.
I think I'd say no, and I'd say that for several reasons. Firstly, I think irrespective of what politicians do, the independence debate is not going to die. It would be my view that I think the independence debate is going to continue for the foreseeable future, irrespective of what politicians do. I think secondly, Nicola Sturgeon came out very quickly after the results of the Brexit referendum were known, and was praised for showing strong leadership in that moment where it seemed like there was no plan, and she came out saying, well, this would be my sort of 3-point plan. One, to try and keep the UK in the single market. Secondly, to try and find a compromise deal for Scotland. And thirdly, to look at whether we should put independence back on the table. And she went through that process, and compromise agreements, whatever you think of them, were soundly rejected by Westminster, and therefore she went for the third option. So I think that, again, irrespective of what she did, the Conservatives would have latched on to the unionist argument, whatever Nicola Sturgeon did. So prior to the referendum on EU membership, we had our Holyrood elections. That was 6 weeks beforehand, and even in that campaign, the Conservatives were using the Union and another independence referendum to win support. So in short, I don't think it was a miscalculation. I think that she showed some strong leadership in coming to that position. And I think, indeed, and irrespective of what she'd done, the Unionists have not stopped talking about independence since 2014.
Thank you. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. And I would just like to focus on 3 issues during the campaign, which I think show how British politics is changing. Brexit is certainly massively changing it, but it's not just because of Brexit. And the first issue is the painful episode of social care and its funding, which probably stopped my party's momentum in the polls. And the backdrop to that was that I think there's a widespread recognition we need to do something about the funding of social care. And one of the crucial ways in which the fiscal arithmetic is shifted, it's very hard to see how you can meet these higher and higher bills just out of higher public expenditure programs. When you look at the long-term forecasts from the Treasury, the picture is rather different from the one that Danny painted. It's actually because we've got a population growing older, and we now appear to have voted for tougher migration controls, which reduces the number of working people and people who are net contributors to the exchequer. The backdrop against which any political party has got to operate is one in which the pressures are for public spending to rise anyway. So the thinking in my party was, could we expect those pensioners who have wealth in their houses after their death, out of their estate, to contribute towards the cost of their social care? Now, you know as well as me all the controversy that then erupted. But I thought it was quite interesting that this was, for the first time, the Conservative Party trying to say it is reasonable for people who are sitting on substantial increases in their wealth for that to be used to help fund their social care, rather than the generality of taxpayers, many of whom may have much less wealth, and as we know, particularly for the younger generation, might even not be earning that much. You could have added, and this was obviously then how the argument broke out, should you have added an Andrew Dilnot-style cap, which Theresa did turn to as the controversy went on. But Andrew Dilnot's cap is an attempt to say protects people with very substantial estates from having to make any contribution to their social care costs. And I thought it was interesting that this argument, which was an attempt to identify wealth as a legitimate way in which you could finance this for people who had the wealth, scored so badly. And it leaves me not sure how we think we are going to finance all the different public expenditure programs that we've got. I mean, one clue, however, is that, again, in a turn-up for the books, you've not seen this for decades in my party, we have reduced our pledges on tax cuts and tax limiting compared within the previous manifesto. So a future Tory Chancellor will not be as committed as George Osborne committed his party in 2015 on no increases in income tax or VAT or capital tax. And if I may say so, I think one of the frustrations of the way the political debate has gone is that I don't think if we want the kind of welfare state that Danny was describing, or even the more modest one that I think we need, and I can see the upward spending pressures to enable that to be financed, you can't just pay for it from rich people and banks and big companies. If you want that, you've got to make an argument for the generality of taxpayers, the generality of the community to contribute, and I haven't heard that from Labour. So I actually think that the way that the Conservative Party tried to approach social care was really rather progressive. And the fact that it scored so badly and got into such a mess, I think reminds us of how constrained it is when any party actually tries to find a way of financing a policy. My second example is yours, which I thought was a very good one, Chris, and that was housing. Because it's another area where attitudes have changed significantly. We clearly have a housing crisis. And my party's approach so far on getting more houses built has been financial incentives for first-time buyers, which wasn't a stupid approach. The argument was if you increase their spending power, you've got an incentive for more builders to come in and build. But clearly is not sufficient on its own. We do need to be building many more houses. And you're absolutely right. What we are now seeing is a return to Harold Macmillan, 1950s building, where a lot of the so-called ideological constraints on what a Conservative Party could do have gone. We're now, absolutely, that your statement is, I'm so pleased you spotted that bit in the manifesto. It's a return, that is a return to the New Towns movement of the 1950s and 60s. That's how the New Towns were financed and built. The public authorities acquired agricultural land, built on it, awarded themselves planning permission, built on it, created a new town, used the proceeds to go on and build the next new town. So I think we now have a credible approach to getting more houses built because we're going to be using the public sector alongside the private sector, and we're no longer going to see so much of the value captured by the landowners when they secure planning permission for the land they own. And I guess thirdly, I ought to say something about universities and tuition fees, because I thought that, and that was where I thought what Danny said was quite depressing, really, because I think it's a good rule of social policy. If you're trying to think what you want for poor kids, why don't you look at what the rich kids have already got? And what you've got is, for the most affluent part of the income scale in England, over 60% go to university. If you look at the poorest population, 20% go to university. Now, that is itself significant progress. It's still shockingly low, but it's progress. Before we got into tuition fees, it was 10%. So in the whole period when we're always being told, my party used it against Blair, other people used it against me, if you do this, you'll put poor people off, is completely untrue. The percentage of people from poor backgrounds going to university has gone up from 10 to 20, but it's still way behind what affluent kids are doing. And I used to have this argument with Vince Cable. I represented a relatively low-income constituency with a big council estate and a very large working-class vote. I got in Havant 23% of people going to university. Vince represented a prosperous part of West London and had got 63% going to university. And I said to him, I want more than 23% of people from Havant to go to university. If I know the only way we can achieve this is by someone from Twickenham who's currently going to university not going to sacrifice their place for the kids from Havant, we're going to have a very long wait. The only way you can do this is for more people in total to go, and the only way in turn you can do that is by taking the financing of higher education out of public spending, which is what we did. It's not, of course, anything that students pay up front. It's a graduate repayment scheme so that low-income graduates who aren't in well-paid jobs don't have to pay back. And that has enabled us to remove the cap on numbers, which still exists in Scottish universities, where you have Scottish universities in clearing trying to find English students that they can recruit to go and study in Scotland because there's no constraint on the number of English students, but they won't recruit Scottish students because there is a constraint on the number of Scottish students, which is why there are indeed fewer people from low-income background in Scotland going to university than in England. It's because they have number controls and we don't. All these three issues are linked, and they're linked because they're all in their ways about fairness between the generations. And the question is, how do we what offer are we making to help the younger generations? And my view is that it's right not to expect the generality of taxpayers to fund the full costs of social care if there are people who are in valuable property that can be used subsequent to their death to pay for some of those costs. It is right to build more housing, and my party has made a massive shift in its approach to that to get more houses built. And it's absolutely right to want to see more young people go to university because returns to going to university have not fallen. And even if that were the case, the social value, the cultural value of going to university is still enormous. You always come to Oxford and hear people saying, the professors at Oxford always say there's too many people coming to university. What they're saying is, and of course the incumbents, the people who've already gone, they're always attracted by these arguments that we don't want more of the riffraff coming, but the fact is there are still large numbers of people in this country who would like to go to university and who should have that opportunity, and the only feasible way that any party has found of removing those number controls is by the liberalisation I was describing. So these three policies have something in common. They're all in their different ways attempt to offer a fairer deal to the younger generation.
Could I ask you, David, Danny picked up on this, that the Conservative manifesto in some areas has moved significantly to the left, the return of state intervention perhaps. So I wonder about that. Do you feel that that's a reaction to the Brexit vote that we know in part was this take back control slogan, and that people want to see some kind of state agency to know that the people they are paying their taxes directly to can act, can intervene, that there's a kind of almost an austerity fatigue now in the country where people are ready to see some more investment in public services, and therefore the Tories are pragmatically as ever moving slightly to address that?
Well, it is a paradox, and I'm sure David, who's going to talk about the crucial issue of Brexit, I mean, David may touch on this, but it is a paradox that Brexit seems to have led British politics to converge closer on continental models, which you would have thought Danny might welcome. But that is actually what we're talking about. We're talking about, certainly in the case of my party, a significant shift. Now, in the 1980s, I worked for Margaret Thatcher. For me, the free market agenda of the 1980s was necessary and transformed Britain for the better. I think what it's left my party with is without a proper account of the role of government. And we are not Montana neoliberals who want to head for the hills and never have any dealings with government. You can have an argument about whether government should spend 37% of GDP or 40% of GDP, which Danny has tried to turn into a battle between barbarism and civilization. But that's kind of roughly where we are in modern Britain. So Conservatives spend quite a lot of money. Why do we do it? And we were trapped in the belief that the only thing you could use public money for was for helping poor people. Actually, one of the jobs of government is to be a bearer of risk. It is a bearer of risk, which is why when I was in government and innovation and science and industrial strategy was one of my responsibilities, one of the jobs of government is to bear risk for innovation, to help new technologies on their way to market. Another is social insurance. And bearing of risk is a legitimate role for government. And I think you will find in the Tory manifesto, indeed, a rather more positive account of the role of government than you would have found in the past. So this is a manifesto which hasn't got ambitious promises on tax cuts, has got an explicit recognition of the role of government, is willing to use government to tackle a problem of getting more houses built that has been with us now for well over a decade, but recognises you've got to be selective and expects affluent people to make a contribution where they can, be they graduates who are subsequently in well-paid jobs, or be they pensioners who have valuable estates. That's roughly where we are. That's why I don't recognise the picture of my party that Danny painted.
Thank you. All right, and to the other, David.
Thanks very much. I'm sort of slightly humbled by somebody who's come all the way from Lochaber to speak here and so on. And there's me moaning if I have to kind of do a 50-minute tube journey to go and speak. I shall never complain again. It's really good to be able to have that kind of that breadth and geographical connection. I suppose almost as good as having the New Statesman's Scottish correspondent working out of Oxford. Yeah. So I suppose it's kind of a swap, really, isn't it? And I'm sure they're all very happy about that up in Scotland, and no one's complained.
I do live in Scotland, I should say.
Actually, yeah. It kind of it makes me feel like I'm a kind of space traveller and so on. Where are we actually now? One of the besetting problems that you have in discussions like this when you get close to an election is that speakers speak as if their views are synonymous with the views of the electorate. I have long since realised that my views are not necessarily synonymous with the electorate. Although I enjoyed Danny Dorling's rule of 4 weeks late polls. I've never heard that rule of polls before, Danny, and you can show it to me at some point or other. Since people presumably 4 weeks after election are being asked how they would vote at an election next week and so on, I don't quite see how it could possibly work. But nevertheless, I take your word for it that it does. We're 18 days shy of the first anniversary of the referendum. What an incredible amount we've accomplished in that year, haven't we? I mean, haven't we? It's been a full year since we voted to come out of the EU, and what a lot we've accomplished. We've accomplished so much that we can't even have a discussion about what we should do about Brexit a year after in a general election called largely in order to give the governing party a significant majority in order to discuss Brexit. Yeah? It's pathetic. There's no other phrase for it. It's pathetic. It's pathetic about the parties and it's pathetic about us, frankly. And that's why I don't get to agree with the electorate and so on. In fact, actually, I do think Brexit is running under this election, but in a very, very peculiar way. Because I actually think, probably, I intuit, that quite a lot of the youth vote turning out for Corbyn is actually, in its own way, a reflection on the Brexit vote and what on earth they're supposed to do with their futures and so on in the period as we enter into this, whatever it is that we are entering into. There has been, I think there was one day in this election where we had Brexit Day. And that was the day at which we couldn't work out what the Labour Party's position on Brexit actually was. Well, that doesn't matter, because we don't actually know what the government's position on Brexit is. We have had two phrases, as you know. Brexit means Brexit, which none of us know what that means. And we don't, and that's not just a cheap joke, none of us actually know what it means. And also, no deal is better than a bad deal, and we don't know what that means either. We actually don't know what it means, and so on. But these are the things which are kind of repeated to us. There are a series of things that are told to us about what it is that people who voted for Brexit voted for when they voted for Brexit, which some of them will recognise as being the things they voted for, and some of them won't recognise as being the things that they voted for. We voted, apparently, because this was a take-back control vote, we voted to come out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which, incidentally, a significant proportion of the electorate don't know we were under in the first place. And in any case, a lot of the people who campaigned around Brexit thought was synonymous with the European Court of Human Rights, which it isn't. It's a completely different court and has no similar jurisdiction. So a lot of people who are thinking that they might have voted to come out the ECJ didn't know what the ECJ was. So this is a construction, a post facto construction by the government, trying to work out what it is that they could say Brexit was. For whose benefit? For the electorate's benefit. Was there, when we went around campaigning or arguing about Brexit, such an incredibly sophisticated notion of what Brexit consisted of, that we could say, yes, you don't take this, you do take that, and so on. When we've looked at polls, what you see is, by and large, that people want the maximum access to the European market whilst not actually, the single market, whilst not actually being in the EU. And when you pose that question against freedom of movement, you get a pretty even divide. And yet, nevertheless, the UKIP tail has wagged the whole British dog when it has come to the question of the definition of what Brexit actually should be. Now, my proposition to you is that young people are not really stupid, and so on. And although they might find it difficult to know how it is that we reverse the position, I think actually quite a lot of the reaction to this and the late support, particularly we have 69% in the polls of support for the under-24s for the Labour Party. And I don't think that's because they've gone through the Labour Party manifesto or because they're just idiotic and think everything the Labour Party promised will come to pass. We absolutely love it. I don't buy Danny's analysis to this extent, which is the whole problem actually with the Labour Party manifesto is that it almost certainly won't raise the money that it wants to in order to do the things that it says it wants to do. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has said as much, and almost anybody kind of examining it can't find it either. And what a very peculiar set of priorities it is, if you're interested in redistribution, to spend £11 billion on subsidising middle-class kids to go to university and to maintain the freeze on welfare benefits for the poorest. It's a really peculiar thing to do. And Danny, what you actually said about access to university is the most depressing thing I've heard from a so-called left-winger for a very, very long time. Think about what you actually said there. You said that you were against universities trying to get poor kids into universities. You said it in terms. Now, I spent a lot of my earlier life. Yes, you did.
I'm against them tricking people just to get money.
No. You don't know whether they're tricking them any more than they're tricking the kids from the upper classes.
100% are tricked at Eton to go to university. Why don't other schools try tricking them the same way?
Absolutely. It's an extraordinary position. You want to rethink it. It's not where you want to be on this. Honestly, I mean...
there's a mainland European country where children go to university without fear of debt.
Fine.
Which doesn't have our social divide.
That's fine, in which case your problem is going to be not how many... You'll want the same number of kids to go to university, presumably. You'll want more. You'll have to find a way of funding, getting universities incentivised to do that. Yeah. You'll have to find a way of covering that 11 billion quid, and therefore, and presumably if you want to do other redistributive things, like the welfare freeze, you'll have to find even the welfare cap, you'll have to find even more money.
You have to look at European countries, and you'll find out how they do it.
Okay, look at them, but you're all going to have to pay. And the one thing they have in common, by the way, Danny, is that they all have greater ordinary levels of taxation, income taxation. That was the thing you missed out, because you always do. You always do this thing of pretending that you can just tax the richest and you'll get it automatically, and you don't have to tax the middle classes and so on. And actually, we've had a position in this country of gradually taking more and more people out of income taxation and so on, so that we actually leave the income tax basis for people on a narrow range of people. That's what you've actually got to do. But even this incredibly redistributive Labour government, which isn't actually redistributing, the party can't actually bring itself to say that in its manifesto, because the myth that we have to create, and funnily enough, it is one of the things that Theresa May's tried to get away from, or hint that she's trying to get away from, is that you can have everything you want without actually you paying for it, someone else will. That's the trick, you know it. We all know it. That's the trick they're trying to play. Anyway, The reason why I've attached this to a kind of Brexit thing, and I should probably stop, is that because the outcomes of Brexit, which has got most of our civil servants working on it for the last year and the best of them working for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead, is that we haven't the faintest idea what the economic outcome of the Brexit negotiations will mean, and whether we will have the taxation basis to be able to do any of the things that the parties suggest that they could do. And there's a very large and big suggestion that actually we won't, and that the long-term cost to us of Brexit will be pretty substantial, not least in the amount of income we will have. And none of the parties have to answer questions on that basis, because no one has asked them. No one's put it to them, because all they will say is, in the end, and no one will get behind it, is, well, we'll have to see what comes out of the negotiations, whatever the negotiations are. So we should have been clear right from the beginning. The more we want to stay within an integrated situation with Europe, the less cost probably we will have to pay, and therefore the more of the other things we will probably be able to do. That was the equation. Have you heard that discussion? Have you? And then David raises the point absolutely rightly, which is, in addition to that, the Conservatives' promise on immigration will cost us a hell of a lot of income. A hell of a lot of income, quite apart from being illiberal and stupid and probably unreachable and so on. But it will also, insofar as they try to enforce it, it will probably cost us a lot of money as well. So no wonder that a young voter who might not know all those things but might intuit some of them looks at not the other positive things that you might say about the Conservatives, but looks at grammar schools and looks at migrants and looks at Brexit and hard Brexit, etc., and thinks to themselves, what's there here for me? What? And I can't answer the question, because I don't know what's in it for them. You asked me right at the beginning, because that headline, Yikes, I might have to vote Tory, was actually, I don't think I could vote for Jeremy Corbyn, and I don't think I could vote for... I mean, can you imagine of having a situation whereby we both have Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister? I mean, it will become insane at this point. I don't know, you might just as well vote for Vladimir Putin, etc. I mean, it's kind of, you kind of get into this level of absurdity. This is a problem. So in the end, I voted for a Liberal Democrat in my constituency who doesn't even live in the constituency and hasn't canvassed once because they've given up. Because, the perfectly nice party with good positions, etc., probably more honest positions on things like tuition fees. They've actually got an honest position about how to raise taxation, etc. But unfortunately, they're led by somebody who somebody once described as looking like a bingo caller with a face like a macaque. Not his fault. Not his fault. But at the moment you need an Emmanuel Macron, this is what we've got. So, I mean... So we're going into and then we get the question which was raised first of all, which was no kind of question at the beginning of the election. What I want to know is what everybody's going to do on terror, which seems to be a very kind of big question at the moment. Is that really what's going to decide the British election in the end? Despite all these other things that we've talked about, is that what it's going to be? Anyway, I've yabbled on for too long.
That's a typically non-pugilistic contribution from you, David.
Sorry.
Slightly, yeah. Do you agree with the Prime Minister's immigration target of tens of thousands?
I don't see how we could get it down to tens of thousands. And I think if one did try to do it, I was in the meeting where people tried in the past. The costs are very high, costs for groups like university.
And David...
So what he's saying is, he doesn't think it's feasible, he doesn't want to do it anyway.
No.
I mean, in fact, if it was feasible, it'd be even more disastrous, wouldn't it? That's the...
There is a category of policies of whom that description is true, yeah. We've all in our long careers seen that.
And David, one last question for you before I open it up. The polls at the moment are suggesting a decent working majority for the Conservatives, but probably giving Corbyn enough to stay, which is catastrophic for people like you, isn't it? Because you're going to have, the left still empowered. You're going to have people who are probably not going to have the guts to step away from the Labour Party, a sort of Macron situation, because the Labour Party still seems to be reasonably popular, or more popular than we perhaps realised.
Well, we know that creating new parties in the British situation is incredibly difficult. I have a strange kind of antagonism towards the Scots on this basis, which is irrational, which is back when we had the alternative vote referendum and so on. Scots already have versions of the alternative vote in their internal elections. And we put it up for national referendum. 3 places voted for it, and Oxford wasn't one of them. The 3 places were Camden, Islington and Cambridge. Scotland voted against it, and they've got it. Why did you do that?
Did it not clash with another vote that day?
Oh, was it that was it? That was it.
Yeah, I think it was probably something pretty simple.
We have every voting system known to man in Scotland, because we have, for Westminster first past the post, for the Scottish Parliament we have the additional member system, and for councils we've got STV. Is that right? So yes. Scots are just sort of, I mean, as Kim was saying, we're voting all the time. No, we're not. We're just sort of wandering around in this electoral fog, putting our cross in the wrong box. Probably.
I think, like many, just on that point, I think like many of the UK-wide elections, sometimes we feel it isn't our battle. And if I recall on that, I think there was an element of that on Brexit as well, that, you know, we'd had a referendum on the Constitution 2 years before. We didn't want another referendum on constitutional matters.
Why couldn't it have not been your battle the other way?
Good question.
Right, so we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'd like to open it up to questions. Who'd like to go first? You can ask about anything within the realms of the general election. Anyone? Yep, lady over here.
Thank you. I'm from the Republic of Ireland, and I found it both depressing and completely unsurprising that in this whole campaign there's been very little reference to the impact that Brexit is going to have on Northern Ireland. And I'm just wondering if there's a sense that any party has any idea what to do once Brexit hits. Thank you.
Anyone want to lead on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been really interesting is how, as you say, little discussion there has been about Northern Ireland, and it comes back to this constitutional conundrum that I was setting out in Scotland, and the number of times we've voted. Well, Northern Ireland is, you know, in a state of confusion at the moment politically, and that's why I think that Theresa May calling this election was very selfish, because it totally disregarded the situation in Ireland at the moment. You know, from Scotland, we've been watching with close interest because of David Davis's comments about Northern Ireland not having to choose between EU and relationship with the Republic and the union with Great Britain, and that there would not be a hard border, and therefore there would need to be a semi-differentiated solution for Northern Ireland, which we in Scotland would say, well, can we have some of that too, please?
One interesting thing about Northern Ireland, when the referendum on Brexit occurred, people said, oh, this will just be the first country. Country after country after country will leave the EU. What the Northern Ireland issue is showing is how unlikely it is for any other country to leave. The only one that's ever left is Greenland, and I think they're still EU citizens through Denmark. This is very good news for Greece as leaving. Solidarity of the mainland of the continent has increased, but it just shows how almost impossible it is after 30, 40 years of being together when you have people moving across a border. And that border's been open for far less time than that. So we're doing a favour to the rest of Europe by demonstrating what was the value of being a member of the Union. Because it's easy not to see the value of something when you get used to it. It's just sad for us that we're doing it for them.
During the Scottish referendum, when some of us were kind of very anxious to maintain the Union, and some of us down in England, I remember the BBC sent a group up to Lowestoft. And a whole group of people who I have a suspicion, it's my prejudice, would have been staunch Brexiteers. And it was put to them, how worried would you be if Scotland left the Union and said, we really don't care? And you're right. As far as the English electorate is concerned, Northern Ireland is of no concern whatsoever unless bombing starts again, at which point there will be a concern about it and people will lament it and presumably blame Theresa May for cutting police numbers and so on. But and it has been the devil's own job to try and introduce it into the... I mean, the BBC's had a good go at it. It's located programmes in Northern Ireland. Part of the difficulty, actually, is a lack of complete agreement, as far as we can see, within Ireland itself about what the impact... I mean, some of the fantasies about the complete technological border whereby, you know, the virtual border, whereby you'll set off something on the border which will either say yay or nay, and nobody will actually have to be stopped and so on. And nobody's sure about how this will work.
If you look at the referendum, if you look at the vote by age, of course, we know that the median age, the tilt age, is about 44. People under 44 on balance voted Remain, over 44 on balance voted to leave, which matches almost exactly, if you track back 44 years, when we signed up to the Treaty of Rome. So I understand what Danny is saying. This is when you're familiar with something, you don't value it. Actually, it looks like the other way around. It looks like the people who had lived in the UK outside the EU were more likely to vote Brexit. And the people who were familiar, it was the only thing that they had known, were the ones who wanted to stay. And I do think that that is another example, I have to say, regrettably, of a generational divide in British politics.
Yeah, I mean, younger people are. And this is not just, I mean, one of the problems I've had with the sort of David Goodhart somewheres, anywheres, recategorisation of class, etc., is for it really to be true, then the kids of the anywheres and somewheres would be the same as their parents, and they're not. So it really is a kind of generational question, and there's been a shift on this. And you can't help wondering where we will sit on this in 5 years' time. I mean, gradually, bit by bit, the majority of the people who voted Brexit is dying. You know, they're kind of been carted off into the Radcliffe, etc. You know, and every time you see a hearse going down the road, there's a 4 in 5 chance that it's a Brexiteer that you're seeing, and so on. Whereas every time you see somebody getting a bar mitzvah or something like that, in 3 or 4 years' time, they're going to want to join the EU. And that's likely the way it's going to be. And I just don't know how that will be by the time we get to the next election. I mean, will people just kind of settle down and say, well, whatever it is we've got, and we've got to kind of stick with it? I've known that the bully point of the Brexiteers is, well, if we tried to reapply for membership of the European Union, they would enforce upon us we've been in such a weak position, they'd enforce on us such draconian terms we wouldn't want to do it, to which your impulse is to say, oh, thank you very much for that then. That helped then, didn't it? But also, you don't know, and that's likely to be as much total bullshit as everything else you told us during the course of the lead up to the vote.
Okay, any other questions? Yep, woman. Hang on, wait for the microphone. It's just coming.
I totally agree with David Aaronovitch about Brexit. I think Brexit in this election has been the biggest elephant in the room. We do not know what's going to happen in the future, and it looks pretty gloomy to me. I can't understand why Theresa May, who voted to remain, should have opted for a hard Brexit. I cannot understand why she did that when there were so many other alternatives.
Well, luckily, David can explain.
Surely the government also, the Tory government, has forecasts. They must have forecasts about what will happen in the next few years. Can we hear about them?
Well, first, I'm not privy to what the Conservative government is. I'm not a member of the government. I can't, but if you look at these documents, now, and David is right, we haven't seen as much as we need, but it's clear already from the documents and what you get in exchanges with ministers that they are up for Britain joining specific EU programmes that they think are of value for the UK. And there's an awful lot now of kind of sharp elbow negotiation going on within Whitehall as what the ranking of these programmes are and which programmes we should try to join. And obviously, because of my background, I'm most familiar with some of the arguments around research and science. And I think it's possible we would either apply to join Horizon 2020 and its successors, the European Research Programme, or in some way set up a fund to match it, to enable us to contribute, to continue to participate. Also around here, we've got Culham and Euratom, which is now a big question mark, where we need to find some way in which we can participate in European nuclear programs. And I think, I don't know what's going to happen post the election, but if the Conservatives are back and Theresa is negotiating with David Davis, I think you will find her. She will have a list, not unlike what she had as Home Secretary when she took us out of some of the European domestic security programs and then took us into a subset of those which she thought were essential for UK security. So that could be the approach.
Although the argument against that, which has been made, is that that was a very different type of negotiation, with a willing European Union, where the whip hand wasn't entirely in the hand of the EU at that point, whereas now we've started the timetable. We've got less than 2 years now, and they are now, I think we've scheduled our negotiations so that one of the first things we need to negotiate is how much we're going to pay to the European Union, so they can just sit there and say, until you give us something like what we want, we're not going to get into any of these bits that are important to your future.
But they may have an interest. I agree that you can't appeal to goodwill, but they may have themselves an interest in our participating in some of these programs. Because remember, part of the reason for this argument now about whether we have to pay a massive kind of leaving bill is precisely that our departure leaves a hole in the European finances. So I'd have thought a minister turning up and saying, I'm willing to pay X million in order to participate in the following programme, and Y million or whatever, I'd have thought that would make sense to them. Now, I'm speculating, but you will find already in the government's document, however, some willing, they're explicit that they are up for our joining specific programmes that are of benefit.
Danny, there was held to be a slight ambiguity in Jeremy Corbyn's position on Brexit, and that there were aspects of the European Union that the Labour left would happily do without. Do you see the prospect from the left, centre-left, of Brexit actually giving us a chance to do things a bit differently and reorder society along the way you were talking about earlier?
Yeah. Well, Corbyn's from that generation when there were people on the left who ganged up with people on the right to try to not join the community in the first place. And that's why he said 7 out of 10. He is being honest. He has a terrible habit of being honest about his opinions on things. If you look at what Keir Starmer wants, and in general what the party wants, it is a party that largely didn't want to leave, wanted to be in much more, and its voters largely wanted to be in. The problem for Theresa is that she chose to call the election after she got the letter from the EU that said that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So these Whitehall departments can, put down these things and they can negotiate and they can have it all on a list of we might be in Horizon 2020 if the Swiss don't mind the fact that we're going to try and pull the fast one that they didn't. They were not allowed to take European research money and be racist, essentially. But we can have all these negotiations for a year and a half, and then the whole lot can be lost at the very end, because it isn't all agreed till the very end. It's going to be knife edge. And you either do that with David Davis and Boris Johnson playing Russian roulette about whether their egos go, and you get nothing at the end, or you play it with a calmer set of parties, which in a hung parliament, I think a hung parliament would only last till autumn. I think if you look at the extreme polls about Theresa not getting a majority, you're looking at 1974 again, and you're looking at on October, November general election. And we're partly in that kind of a mess. But the key thing about the negotiations is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed at the very last minute. So it's going to be knife edge. And the markets are going to love that. And people who speculate on the pound are going to love that. It really is a mess to have got ourselves into. If you want the silver lining on this, for me, I think if it had been 52% Remain, 48% Leave, UKIP would still be high up in the polls. We'd have calls for another referendum. This wasn't going to go away. If you look at the money behind it, the money began with James Goldsmith in 1997, who just got 2% of the vote. And then at every European election, huge amounts of money came into UKIP, enormous amounts of money, and the popularity of UKIP rose. After the election, the European elections, they plummeted. There was no groundswell of support for this. It was simply a few rich men buying support and the Daily Express. And eventually they got there. The official spending on the referendum was 52% Leave, 48% Remain. That's how much money was officially registered to buy your votes. And that doesn't include all the tabloid support for Leave. So this would have carried on. The money wanted an exit from the EU. The money would have got it at some point. The question is, what kind of exit we're going to have? And it doesn't have to be no deal. No deal really is, unless you believe we're going to become the centre of an empire again and all eat New Zealand lamb. But the other nice thing about this, if you like, apart from the suffering, is that we get to test out the theories of the people who think we are somehow genetically superior to the rest of the planet and membership of the EU's held us back, and we're going to get our rightful place at the top again. It's going to call
The
everything
thing about the March on Rome was you could see what Mussolini would really do. And the trains ran on time.
I mean, for me, the big question is about information and the extent to which the electorate and Parliament get a say in what the Brexit deal is. And going back to why people voted the way they did in a hard Brexit, and the spectrum of reasons for people voting leave. I mean, again, to come back to Scotland, just because I think it's a fascinating little way of analysing the reasons why people voted. If you take, for example, the fishing industry, so we have, quite a lot of, the majority of fishing is landed in Scotland, and that was a big sector for voting to leave. And yet the fish processing sector was a big sector for voting remain. And in terms of who gets to decide and the reasons why people voted the way they did, just a huge diversity of views. And I think it comes back, it really does go hard to the battle for Britain as to why the different devolved nations voted the way they did, the way Northern Ireland voted, the way that Scotland voted, and the way Wales voted, and in the aftermath, how they've responded to the outcome and how they negotiate or relate to Theresa May. So the impression in Scotland, or the Scottish Government, very frustrated in terms of putting forward ideas, proposals, compromise solutions, but either not getting a response or it being rejected. And so what is the role of the UK government in terms of bringing people together? What I think they've done is drive an even harder wedge between Leavers and Remainers in the year since the vote. They've certainly not been bringing them together. They've been causing a greater divergence between them.
Okay, well, we're sort of out of time. I just wanted to finish, given it's 3 days till a general election, by asking our panel for the prediction about who's going to win and what the majority will be. So why don't we start over here with you, David, given you voted Lib Dem as a Lib Dem government?
So, yeah, it's on the cards. Dan, you'll remind me, the range is 3 to 12, isn't it? Since you've been looking at the polls.
Between the polls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A 3-point Tory lead and a 12-point Tory lead. That's the range.
That's the range, apart from UKIP's poll in the Independent 2 hours ago, which is 1% lead.
Oh, so it's a 1% and the
12,
11 and 12% leads and so on. Okay, so which poll do you believe? And on what basis do you decide to believe the 1% poll versus the 12% poll? If you know the answer to that question, then in that case, and you know it, you really know it, or you have some kind of magical intuition which has served you well for every election up until now, then in that case you'll be happy making the prediction. According to any kind of usual notion of evaluations of leadership and economic programs and trust in economic programs, you would anticipate that the 11-point lead is more likely to be the real one, and that the Conservatives will get an 80-seat majority. Set against that is the extraordinary, not implosion of Theresa May, but the kind of diminution, the self-diminution of a major leader in a way which is almost kind of quite unique in modern politics. I don't think I've ever quite seen it. And David, you might have a kind of better idea. And so, whereas you could say the most likely thing probably would have been, under normal circumstances, to call it an 8. I mean, just think, for instance, if the Tories are getting extra seats in Scotland, how are they going to lose so many seats in England that they don't get an enhanced majority? It's very, very difficult to see how that kind of works out. So I suppose, actually, if I have to screw it to the post, it's going to be a Tory majority of between 50 and 80 is the most likely outcome as far as I can see. But that's not a prediction.
Well, I have no great wisdom on all this. I'm reflecting, following on from David's suggestion, reflecting on my own experience. I can remember several elections where the polling was predicting a much worse result for the Tories than actually happened. I can remember in '87 when the Tory party had a landslide. I was working for Margaret Thatcher in that election. Up till midnight, it was supposed to be too close to call. People weren't, and there's a pattern which goes through up to 2015 when people didn't expect the Conservatives to win. So I do think there is this kind of spiral of silence effect. Now, of course, the pollsters are now trying to adjusting for it. They'll say we're now taking account of it. But I would have thought a working Tory majority was very possible, perhaps a majority of 50, something like that.
Mm-hmm. So in Scotland, the SNP currently have 56 out of 59 seats.
Yes.
So I'll ask you for your prediction about how many seats the SNP will have.
Okay, so I think they will have between 48 and 52.
Okay. Good. And Danny, what's your national prediction?
That's my national prediction. I do wonder about the spiral of silence, whether the embarrassing thing at the moment is to admit that you'd vote for this weird pacifist of a man. So you don't admit that you'd vote for Corbyn, but you might quietly go and do it. I think it'll still be a Conservative government, but not with much more of a majority, maybe even less, depending on the targeting. That would be my guess, the way things are going at the moment. Labour traditionally have been very good at being popular between elections. But the Conservatives, before UKIP, were the masters of becoming popular 83, 87, just before each one, with the money spent. But I think it'll be a Conservative government. I can make one rash prediction, which I might as well make in public just in case it turns out true. The problem with predictions is that people always talk about the ones they got right. I'd be willing to bet you a pint, only up to 10 of you, that Theresa May will not be Prime Minister in a year, even if there is a Conservative government, given the record of what she's done over the last few weeks.
Well, let's meet back here in a year, and if we can take Danny's wallet out and have a drink. Well, listen, thank you very much for coming. I hope that was of interest and reasonably educational, revelatory, entertaining. I think if we just maybe thank our panel for their time this evening, especially Dingwall.